Right, let's make a start. Welcome everybody to the last of this month's Mentoring Professionals session. As you know, the sessions this month are themed on customer satisfaction, both internal and external, around IT. And we've covered a range of topics, benefits realization. We've covered service improvement. Certainly I've run a couple of sessions. There's been some other sessions around projects and programs and other activities. So it's been a rich set of topics, and we were been keen to run a service management panel session. So looking forward to it with the fellow mentors I've got. I'll ask them each to introduce themselves. So we've got John, Brendan and Surinder joining me on the panel. I've got a series of questions that I will guide us through. Feel free to ask questions via the group chat, which I know John has already opened up and started to type on. I'll keep monitoring that, and then we'll feed that in, and we'll pause at appropriate points for questions from the group, either from the chat, or if somebody's feeling brave and wants to unmute themselves, then feel free, and we'll work that through. We had the session booked for 2 hours. I know it's an odd time of the day for some people. Thank you, John, and thank you others who joined at unusual times. From various parts of the world. I will try and keep this to around an hour and a half, but we'll see how lively the discussion is. I don't want to cut things short, but equally I'm acutely aware that people have other things to be doing during either the day or night or morning, depending on where they are in the world. So let me introduce myself. I'm Mark Burgess. I'm one of the mentoring professionals, primarily focused around service management. Here I run the service management channel in the Slack environment that we have. You'll know we've had a series of questions of the week. I've also turned some of those into LinkedIn articles. I've got a wide background, and I'm not going to make this a CV review, but I've fulfilled a number of service management roles, starting initially from what we called end user computing, quaintly back in the day, where we had some people who were actually starting to use the first PCs that we had and starting to write their own code. All the way through, including periods running change advisory boards, major incidents, problem management, had my time as a process owner, run some service improvement programs, done a lot of service transition in various organizations, and also some service management consultancy. So I've written a couple of service management strategies that were absolutely fascinating, because that's not something we get to do very often, and also run, as I say, a few service improvements. So it's been an interesting career, and keen to pass on some of that expertise and the expertise of the other mentors through this. But as you'll recognise, the questions today are as closely tied as I can get them to customer service and service management. If it isn't about delivering to the customer, then we're kind of missing a trick anyhow. So we'll guide you through the questions, and as I say, we'll pause at various points for feedback and comments from you, and then we'll have a chance for some general Q&A at the end. Excellent. So we'll introduce the mentors. We'll ask Surinder to go first, if that's okay, Surinder.
Just unmuting myself. My name is Surinder Korotana. I'm based in London, and I am a service designer, but I have spent a lot of my career in IT working within the service management space, doing engineering processes and also helping with the BAU stuff from a design perspective. So my career spans about 7 years. It's not lengthy at all. I come from an investment background, but and this is where I found my niche. So yeah, service management is something that I really take on board when I'm doing my design work.
Excellent. Thank you, Surinder. Brendan, if I can ask you to go next, please.
Yes, hello everybody. I think I can just keep this shorter and say that I overlap a lot with the two other guys that presented here as well. So I'm based in Oslo, Norway, and I got a company here. It's very small, but we do a lot of the same stuff. That's a lot of service management, project management, etc. And I think this is really cool. Thanks for inviting me onto this panel.
You're welcome. Thanks, Brendan. And last but by no means least, John.
Hey everybody, I'm John. As you can tell by my background, I'm in Australia, kind of. Yeah, my background is in service management, IT service management. I love service management. I like the structure around it, and more recently got into design thinking and customer experience. So I've kind of focused myself on those two. So really looking forward to a great session tonight.
All right. Excellent. Thanks, everybody. So as you can see, we've got a rich panel, people from various backgrounds and various parts of the world, which is great to hear. So as I say, I've got a series of prompts and questions just to kick the discussion off. I'm going to ask each of the questions and then ask one of the mentors to lead on that. And then I'll ask the other couple of mentors just for their thoughts before we move on to the next question. As usual, we'll start with one question and may end up somewhere completely different, but we'll start with that. And the first question I have is what does good customer service mean to you? And Brendan, I'll ask you to go first on that, if that's okay, please.
All right, thanks. The first thing, whenever I saw that question, one of the first things that came into my mind was this idea of being proud. And it's something that it's a really difficult thing to measure. If it's a service desk or if it's IT or HR, are people proud of the work they're doing, and are the customers being given services that they really feel like the people that we work with, they have real pride in their job. And sometimes there's a place where I deliver my car to get serviced and to get washed. And the guys there, and I talked to these guys, and one of them he studied IT in Dublin in Ireland for 7 years. And he found that this was his place. He just loves working with cars. He loves doing the full service of cars. He loves handing them back to people. And I love chatting to this guy because he's got a real pride in his work. And that's why I keep visiting him, because I know, like me as a customer, he's like, this guy, he lights up every time I meet up. He's like, he's so happy to see me. He loves his job. And I just love that interaction that we have with each other. So I think that if we could measure pride in people's job, I think that would be great. It's a difficult, hard measure to get. You can measure it, but it's difficult to measure.
Yeah, and that's pride from the people that are helping to deliver the service, I take it, Brendan. Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. No, it's a great point. And I think what I've found is that having spent time as a service manager, service delivery manager, service level manager, the role title tends to vary organization by organization. Getting to understand the customer, having pride in the service that you deliver, and getting to a point where you would actually buy that service if you had a choice, that's where I like to get to. And I think being a strong advocate for that and recognizing that positive feedback from customers is definitely part of it. I think it's also made me less tolerant of bad service, whether it be from another IT organization in my personal life or at work, or, maybe it's taking a car in, it's made me less tolerant of bad customer service. So when I've had a customer experience personally that hasn't necessarily hit the mark, then I've found my experience as a service manager has made it just rankle a little bit. And I've felt the need to point out that they could possibly do a bit better. But yeah, I find I'm less tolerant of poor service from other organizations now.
Yeah, I think any people or any groups or teams that we've worked with, if we notice a sense of pride in their work, it's just so easy. It's like you get this little energy boost, like, wow, these people like what they do, and they take such pride in the result at the end of this value chain or whatever it is. It's just a really nice, beautiful thing that it would be super to get a measurement on. But I'm not actually sure how I would do that. But it would be really highly ranked on the measurements.
I used to work for a head of who said the best performing teams have a buzz, and you can just tell they have that buzz. And I think the sort of pride you're describing, you could try and measure it and analyze it, but you know what? Sometimes you just know. You just know that team, whether it be service desk through to the application support team, the infrastructure teams, the service managers and so on, the change managers, you just know that they've got that level of pride in what they do, and that what they're delivering is the best for the customer every day. Sometimes you just feel it. All right, excellent. Thanks, Brendan. Surinder, what are your thoughts on what does good customer service mean to you?
So yeah, I'm all in for what Brendan has just said, but so I'm just going to put a spin on this slightly, because I'm not going to look at it from a service management perspective, because obviously I sit, not 80% of my time I'm sat in a project from a design strategy perspective, but because I've worked in service management, I always see things from a service management perspective. So how am I going to deliver my design in terms of satisfaction for the customer? and the business. So I have to literally put on two hats, a design hat and a service management hat, because I need to see that everything's functioning when it gets to BAU, for example. And one thing I do remember on my last project, an example is customer satisfaction was a huge thing, and KPIs were not measured. There were no KPIs. So in terms of especially the service catalog, which Mark and I have done a session on before, what does good look like? I had no idea because there was no data for me to go by. So my first impressions of the whole thing were, this is actually not good in terms of us delivering. You know, that can be anything. And I'm going to use a service catalog example here. So I took it back to basics as a designer, thinking about, okay, what's going to happen to this when it gets to service management, you know, and those guys are looking after it. So I sat down with them and worked out what the KPIs could look like, and then developed reports. So there's kind of a multivariate approach to this, in my humble opinion, but I look at things very differently when we talk about service management, because I don't directly sit there and wait for things to be passed on to me. So I'm creating a lot of stuff. So I want to do the best possible thing I can from inception to execution. So that journey in between is kind of my responsibility. I do endeavor to do what I can to get it to, you know, this is what good looks like. However, having said that, I think that there are, you know, a project could last 7 years, and I have done a project for, you know, 4 years and then 3 years. So what could happen, or what it could entail, is, you know, a lot of hiccups on the way to getting it to BAU and getting it to service management. But it's a process of kind of evolution and change and everything else to get it to that. But again, I look down into service management to see what, you know, is good practice. So my view on it is very different to, I guess, somebody who's actually a service manager, for example, or service desk analyst, for example.
Yeah, and that doesn't make it any less valid, of course. I've worked I've worked receiving things from build teams, from development teams, and from projects where they just don't give really much of a thought to the design, the service, and so on. And so I think, you know, for me, good service when it comes to service transition is about having everything that's needed from the point at which the IT system or service is live, being ready to be able to support it. What somebody I worked with fairly recently described as kind of feeding and watering it. Can you patch it? Can you update it? Can you manage it? You know, have you got a maintenance? Just understanding all of that. How do you keep the system operating at the best it can be, and having that all ready, rather than putting it live and then thinking, oh yeah, we've got to do all that stuff, haven't we? Yeah,
I mean, there's a lot of stuff that gets, you know, band-aided within a project. I am going to use a strong word now. I hate it, because it then comes back to me ultimately, and, you know, I mean, if that is the scenario, it'll come back to me and it'll be, oh, well, you didn't do this right. So then we go back, you know, to things like early life support and even before that. And it's just a constant vicious cycle. So I'm of the opinion that if we're going to do it, we do it properly. If we haven't got things in place, for example, KPIs, let's talk and communicate that, and let's get those set out so we can move forward with it and be on the same page. That's very important. I find sometimes project teams and service management are on two different teams. And I don't entirely blame service management because they're not engaged. So engagement is very important for the business.
Yeah, agreed. I wrote a whole article which was based on a kind of question of the day, question of the week from the service management channel around service transition and how we could look to do it differently and better. I would personally ban the term service wrap. It was something that an organization I was working with got into at one point, and that implied that once you'd delivered all of the components, the application and the infrastructure, then you wrapped and added service management around it at the last minute. And it just kind of infuriated me. I have a similar slight twitch when it comes to warranty periods and projects trying to support things for themselves, which, to be honest, I've more often than not seen not go well, and an incident or problem or change has to step in and pick it up when it's not worked particularly well. So, all right, lovely. And finally, not last but not least, John, what does good customer service mean to you?
Right, are you ready? Because I went down the path of, I knew these two were going to go before me, and I knew they were going to make it really hard to follow. So I went down a path of having a statement that's going to stay with you for life. How's this?
Yeah.
He says, really bullishly. So transparent, informed, agreed delivery of value through ever-evolving services. So what I mean by that, right, is transparent, as in, so both parties know what it is that you're supposed to be kind of delivering. So there's that agreement thing that's going on, as well as that informed. Value, so value is different for everybody. So as long as you're agreed on what kind of value is, and it touches on Brendan's, that bit of pride and stuff, you can feel that. It doesn't actually necessarily mean a successful kind of giving of a service. If the attitude's there, there's pride there, people understand, right, that your things go wrong. So if there's that pride and there's that willingness to do the best you possibly can, then I think that incorporates that good customer service, and that ever evolving, because it's always changing, regardless of what our service levels say and what our services are. People come to us with problems, and it always doesn't fit into a nice little box that we can just say, press A, push B, turn it green, and they'll be done. So you need to have that person or people or team on the other end that can just go, right, okay, see it for what it is, and then use their skills with all that personality and professionalism and pride to give them a successful outcome.
Yeah, excellent. I'll come back to the theme of needing to constantly improve, which was actually the topic of the 2 sessions I'd run this week already, was that, you know, we need to have a view that good service means we will look to continually improve it through a service improvement plan. There was a phrase that I picked up from a customer many years ago, longer than I care to admit, when I probably didn't have as many grey hairs, which was they saw it as being providing good service every day. That was about not just having good service on day one, but having it on the next month and the next month. And I remember in the same organisation rocking up to a service review with a fairly challenging customer who I worked with. And we'd had a very bad period. We'd had lots and lots of red on the service report, and particular service had been very unreliable. And we'd put some work into it, and it turned green. And I told him very proudly, I said, yeah, we're green this month. And he looked at me, cocked his head slightly and said, so next month, is it going to be green again or not? Were you lucky this month, or is it planned, and is it now stable? And that kind of, as a young service manager, made me stop and think, I don't have an answer to that question, because I think we might have been lucky. I genuinely didn't know that we'd fixed all of the issues and had it to that point. And for me, when I think of good service, it's going back to that. Right, so do you know that every day and every month you're going to give a good service that the customer can rely on, that they're going to value and that you're proud of, or not? So it's his mind and that comment that he made that always makes me think. Excellent. Thank you, everybody. I'm going to ask another prompt before we open it up to broader questions. We've had one in from Dewan, which is actually very similar to the next question I was going to ask. And the next question is, so how do you assess customer satisfaction with the services that IT provides? So that's specifically around service provision. And Surinder, I think we'll open this one with you, please. Yeah, excellent.
Sorry, I'm talking to myself.
I'm sure it was excellent.
John thinks he scored a brownie point there. Okay, so yeah, service provision. So the environment I've always worked in has been one where you know, service provision has been given this kind of not even a red light, I would say an amber light. It's not something that has been taken into account. And I'm probably giving you an example of something that's probably a bad example, but this happens. So and I do have a good example as well, which I'll share. So if we don't adopt anything in terms of how we're going to roll out services, or how services are going to be possibly what's the word now, and I'm kind of trying to work it out on a roadmap, which is part of my job, then I feel ultimately that we're never going to get to, you know, a point where things are good to go. So what happens in my area of work is I'm working in service strategy, for example, and we're looking at what I'm provisioning in terms of services, and that could be anything. So I use the catalog as an example because that's probably one of the biggest services I've used in my time in IT. So the catalog is huge, as we know and as we've discussed before. So I've always felt as though it's just a thing in strategy or design, but when it gets to transition, and we're talking about a transition environment here as well, so I give you a complex scenario. Nobody thinks of how are we actually going to provision this, right? So it's something that stays quite static at that point of being thrown over the line to BAU or to service management or to whoever catalog manager that's sat in you know, the service management space. So I've always felt, and this is something that I know happens within a lot of businesses because I've spoken to people about this, there's no engagement, right? So if there's no engagement and if there are no comms between the two parties, and I say two parties quite distinctly, I was sat on two different floors here, but what I find is if there's no internal communication, then you could never get to the point where you can say, I've happily provisioned all of this and it's going over. So I think engagement within the business is very important in terms of how you provision services before you even get to engagement with the client. So I've always found that. So my kind of role has always been service strategy is where I go in because I've done bid work as well. So that's where it starts. And then, you know, it never evolves to a point where I'm happy with it, you know, say to be signed off as, okay, this is good to go and this is what we're going to do. It's always something that is kind of left in the ether, but it's picked up later on. So I don't even know if we follow the ITIL framework to do this, but it's something that, you know, needs a lot of engagement. I think, in my opinion, I think it lacks a lot within IT transition environments, especially because everything is done with you know, deadlines in mind and targets in mind, and I think sometimes we lose things. So service provision in my my area of work and my experience has always been something which has not been carefully thought out. So I have always gone back and looked at what are we actually doing with things and how can we actually do this better next time. Another example I'm just going to use is then I've gone on to work for another large government department, which I'm not going to name, but they've asked me to do a lift and shift approach. And I put my foot down and said, I'm not actually doing a lift and shift approach because the original idea was not where it had to be. So a lift and shift approach is not going to work here. So there are a lot of things, you know, that would be factors in how to create success or make success. So I think that's one of them.
Yeah, I think you and I talked before about service catalogs, and we've talked a bit about writing service strategies and so on. And I think it's very important to understand when you talk about customer satisfaction, the business and the customers and the consumers of service need to know, and you need to understand from them what would satisfy them. What do they need from those IT services, and what does that look like? And sometimes I've been in organizations where IT don't understand that, but I've equally been in organizations where sometimes the business kind of struggles to articulate that. And that can make measuring satisfaction very difficult because they don't actually know what they need from that service, sometimes until it's, you know, been mature for quite a while and then started to fall apart. So there's definitely a need to get that business role involved early in understanding what their outcomes are, understanding what their strategy is when it comes to setting a service strategy. And when it comes to a new service and designing it, getting clear requirements from them and looking to build those into the service. I remember an example of having a discussion with a customer early on in a service design where they said, we must have 100% availability. And I kind of like went, okay, do you know how much that would cost? And they said, we must have 100% availability. So we did some maths and said, if you want 100% availability, you know, like it's a 999 service because it's life threatening, it will cost you this. it wasn't a life or death service. It wasn't even particularly business critical, and we very soon had a discussion that said, actually, yeah, we don't need that level of resilience, and it's not that important. But ask somebody what they want, and then talk to them about what they actually need and can afford, and those ended up being different discussions. So there has to be some value for money in that. For me, satisfaction has to talk about value for money as a result as well. John, we'll move to you next. So how do you assess customer satisfaction with the services that IT provide?
Ooh, second favorite question of the night, this. So, so I love where Surinder's coming from. I wanted to add the fact that it absolutely has to be a joint thing, right? We have to understand what we both mean, the giver and the taker, what we mean by satisfaction. So that's really, really important to understand that up front. And then I think it's really, really critical that we get in a room and have a way of receiving feedback, and then get into a room, whether it's filtered by us first and then into a room, or it's just raw feedback, but we get the customer or the customer advocate representative into a room and we go through that feedback and we say, okay, so does this meet what we said at the start? And then you can do that. I've seen some horrendous things from an IT perspective of going, I know what the customer wants. I've had a CIO actually put a chair in a meeting room and say, with a dummy in it, and say, that's the customer, and everything that we do in here needs to have the customer in mind. And I basically said, why don't we just actually invite the customer in, to actually tell us, instead of just putting a dummy in the room. So yeah, I've seen some really, really interesting ways. The best way is actually get them in there and say, hey, we agreed on this.
Yeah.
We've delivered this. This is what our users, our customers are saying. How is it?
Yeah, no, I agree. And I've seen similar stunts pulled where something, I think it was a Lego head, was the last one I saw, was used to kind of represent a customer. And, it was just really felt slightly odd. I was working for a financial services organization that had an IT base somewhere in the north of the country. And that IT base was kind of slightly campus based. It had a whole range of buildings in it, and you couldn't really tell it was a financial services organization. It could have been anything. And one of the directors said, this isn't right, so we need to bring the customer into here. And they did that through various ways. They had customers come in and do presentations in the presentation hall. They put various material up, they'd share information and so on. And then eventually a great big plasma screen in reception as you went in that had a live ticker of Twitter comments from customers of this organization. And if anything makes you really realize whether you're giving good customer service, if you've got external facing service, a view of what the Twitter feed said absolutely did it. Now, there must have been some filtering of this to avoid any of the profanities, because it was pretty big screen, but nonetheless getting that feel. And we're in an organization and a world now where some of these things are very instant by way of feedback. It's not kind of waiting for the next month's service review. When you talk about social media and some of the services that we've got that are online, I was reading about some outages to Microsoft's Exchange services over the last few days, and that seemed to be instant feedback from people that just said, we can't work, what's going on? You can look at down detector, you can look at other mechanisms. So yeah, there's definitely a lot more instantaneous view as to whether customers are satisfied or not. So Brendan, we'll pass to you. I gave John the challenge of going last time, so we'll pass to you and say, what about customer satisfaction and how you measure it?
Yeah, I think it's easiest to go last because I just build on the other guys' things. The first thing I want to build on is John or Mark, this idea of service improvement. I'm 45, and like any 45-year-old, you mentioned the grey hairs first. So any 45-year-old that looks in the mirror then knows that things are falling apart. It's like the body's just getting worse with age. Just like we got to do something. And this idea, if we do nothing, we're just gonna stay the same. That's not the way it is. It just doesn't happen like that. We gotta keep improving. Another thing, this idea of feedback, I don't know if any of you have seen Eric Rice, the guy that does the Lean Startup. He's pretty amazing when he does presentations. So he stops his presentations after 10 minutes and asks everybody in the whole audience to give him feedback on his presentation. It's just it's a crazy way of getting this MVP even in a presentation. So he's like, give me as much feedback as possible along the way, so the audience actually guides what type of presentation he gives. It's a really cool way of thinking about it. Yeah. This idea of engagement that Surinder talked about, it's really good. Some of the best workshops that I've had is where we get different people from the customer side and IT together, and we get like users or customers and managers, like totally different levels, into a workshop with about 14 to 16 people or something. And a lot of what we're focusing on with what we're going to achieve, everybody knows these SMART goals, that you have to have something specific, measurable, achievable, realistic in a time. So before we do that, we go dumber goals, and it's a real fun workshop to do. So what we do is, before we go realistic, we have to think about dreams worth achieving. So we do the dumber framework, and the dumber framework is what would be really daft, and get everybody to brainstorm this first individually. What would be really daft? What would be unrealistic? That's like the D and the U. What would be unrealistic? What would be totally mental? What would be totally mental thing to think about that IT could deliver? What would be really bonkers, but it would be exciting? It definitely would be exciting, even though a little bit ridiculous. And that's what the way we get the customers to brainstorm on dreams worth achieving with IT. And we think of things way outside of the box, because there's no constraints, there's no time constraints, there's no money constraints. Just like we start thinking these crazy things. And then after that, we jump over to the other side, which is this SMART. How do we achieve our dreams? But we have to dream more with the customer. And I think that's like building on this engagement. We have to set some time and say that IT is really here as this term enabler, but nobody remembers the electrician department, or nobody remembers the carpentry department. They're gone, and IT is going to be gone in 100 years. There's not going to be any IT department in 100 years. So it's like sometime between now and 100 years, IT is going to disappear. And before we disappear, I think we should do a lot more of this dreaming with the customer of what's actually possible to dream of, and then trying to break these down into really short, small targets to start achieving dreams. And the last time I did that with a customer, the customer came up, because if the customer needed a new laptop delivered out to the factory, I think it was 3 weeks was the delivery time. It was crazy. And the customer said, I can just run down to the shop myself. It's just down the road. I can buy a laptop and bring it back and have it in my office inside 30 minutes. So your IT is competing against 30 minutes. Like, what's going on here? So, and that was this really nice idea that we did this dumber framework on, and then we moved over to SMART, and then we actually got it down to that amount of time. But it's I think we have to dream more with the customer of what we could do, and then figure out ways of what we can do.
Yeah, that's a great point. And I had £1 for every time somebody said to me, yeah, that laptop will take 6 weeks to come in, but I can go down to insert your favorite electronics store here and get it on the day. Then yeah, I'd be rich. I couldn't quite retire, but I could definitely afford a very nice meal. One of the questions that we've had come in is around measuring customer experience, which was actually something that I hadn't planned specifically on covering, but I had talked about it, particularly when it comes to kind of monitoring and SLAs. So it was part of an article I wrote a few weeks ago. Some SLAs get completely hung up on availability or the number of incidents and so on, whereas actually having some form of measure of, is the functionality working? Is the performance consistent? Does it work in every location? And that's where you start to think about maybe a simulation of a customer journey, having something that simulates clicks and runs that on a regular basis. Now, there is a gotcha around this, which is there was a system that I was working on many years ago that had poor performance, and we started to run a script. I think it used WinRunner or LoadRunner at the time, because they were the tools that we had. And then we ran that, and it worked pretty well. And then a few weeks later, we had complaints that it was actually running much slower. And I'll cut a long story short, we found out that 1/3 of the transactions going through this system were some form of monitoring, you running WinRunner or LoadRunner simulations to test performance. And so the thing that was supposed to assess whether performance was good or not was causing a performance problem. You can overdo it, is kind of the point. But yeah, I think rather than kind of saying we'll monitor the web servers will monitor the network, will monitor the Wi-Fi, will monitor the application and so on, and trying to monitor all the components. There is no substitute for having something that monitors that experience end to end and gives you an early flag. So to Hin's point, either knowing before it goes bang and you start getting those messages on social media or from service desk that there's an issue, or at least you know at the same time, rather than, okay, there's been a problem for half an hour and I've only just found out. And that's where I think that form of good monitoring, where you're simulating customer experience and getting alerts on that's really useful. Good. One more question then quickly. What's the toughest customer experience and feedback that you've had to address, and how did you go about that? John,
I think the toughest feedback I receive, not obviously personally, or maybe personally actually, the toughest feedback I feel is hardest to address is and it goes back to this first point of, we never agreed what the service was in the first place. So yeah. Someone's got very different expectations of what they are supposed to get, and IT's on a very different kind of plane as far as what they're delivering. So this is obviously that we've either done a copy and paste of a previous service catalog or service level agreement, and then we've just gone, well, you know, this is what the other big four are doing, so we'll do it. And then we put a standard set of SLAs to it, and then we go, right, okay, let's measure this and deliver this. And actually our customer just wanted something completely different. So when they go through that experience, they come up with this is rubbish. It should have been there for me at 2 o'clock in the morning. And IT is sat on the other side going, oh, actually, that's a 9 to 5 service, and we don't do that at 2 o'clock in the morning. And there's this disconnect. So that's a really difficult thing then to try and address. And it's a lot bigger, but I think it's quite prevalent.
Yeah, no, understood. Surinder, what's been your toughest customer experience and feedback, and how have you gone about addressing that?
So my one's pretty straightforward. SLAs have been the bane of my life. Creating them and getting them to report consistently. Again, go back to my government projects. Government, you know, I dare say this, but are not very decisive, and I've already mentioned that in my chat. So I don't know how many of you are aware of like how central government works in terms of SLAs and penalizing people on what they're doing. So there were heavy penalties, basically. I'm not going to go into the breakdown of SLAs and what we were penalized with, but I was seeing that accounts were going into red and staying in red for 10 months and no one's doing anything about it, right? Sometimes it's not my shout to do this, but clearly we've got a problem if it's not coming out of red. So, and I know SLAs are the actual problem, and this is not what's working. So I know it's broken, so therefore I will go and fix it. So what I did on my last project was I sat down with my director and I spoke to him about it. I'm not going to say the director was completely oblivious to what was going on. He wasn't. But sometimes kind of looking at SLAs opens up a can of worms or Pandora's box. So I dared to open Pandora's box, and I knew it would be something which would kind of, you know, escalate, and then I'd be thinking, oh, did I want to do this? But yes, absolutely 100% I did, because I was prepared for what was coming next, because I'm a firm believer of we should only fix something if it's broken. And in this case, yes, the SLAs are broken because my incidents are telling me this. So that has been one of my toughest customer experiences. Customer experience is also business experience as well, because you have to get the buy-in from the business as well as the customer, right? So it's a double-edged sword. Who can you please, and how do you please these people? So again, it goes back to my whole idea of communicating that. So me speaking to the director at the time gave me, you know, it leveraged the whole thing for me, because I was able to take it right to the top. I reported into him and said, look, I think this is what we should do. We should scrap all of this. Sometimes it's about saving face and not opening that box, because oh, we're going to get exposed to what we've done wrong. You know what? Do it, because at the end of the day, be transparent. And one thing that this pandemic has taught me as a person, away from work business, in my personal life, and I do employ this with mentoring professionals as well, is be transparent, because being transparent will give you much more integrity within the business and also with your data. Things will become a lot more robust. So as a designer and as a person who studied psychology for a long time, I feel, and I say this time and time again, talk, communicate. If you've made the mistake, or if you haven't got what you need, ask for it. If we need to go back to basics, go back to basics, because you will then rectify 101 problems that could potentially come out in the mix later on for someone else. So that's my take on that.
Yeah, no, agreed. I remember managing a risk service for a financial services organization that was subject to compliance reviews and regulators. And the SLA had availability for schools, and those, based on the way we calculated them, because there weren't major incidents on it, was looking very green. And somebody in the chat talked about kind of watermelon services where they're green on the outside, and the moment you just start picking away at it, it turns red, and this was one of them. By the time we'd finished, we'd found that performance in around 25% of the locations that service was used made it unusable. And so we had to address it, but every month it was reporting green, and there weren't many major incidents, and it was all good. But when you spoke to the customer and spoke to their customers, they were very unhappy. So yeah, we had to address it, and performance issues aren't easy to address, and that's where we ended up doing some of that simulation monitoring from various locations to get some real data. Brendan, we'll close this question with you. So toughest customer experience and feedback, and how have you gone about addressing it?
2008, I think it was, in Oslo, a shipping company, and we were helping them get ITIL things in place, ITIL processes, etc., and roles, everything in place. And one day the whole booking system was down, and the IT director was walking around, and nobody knew why he was walking around, but he found out that everybody was really happy. Everybody was doing their job, and the company was losing a lot of money. And I think that experience for me changed everything. That I think on that day I realized that IT can never be the goal in any organization. That because everybody was so happy, and everybody was like following procedures and following processes and filling their roles, and everybody was so happy. So he just clicked totally. And I think since that scenario, that it's always been the customer measurements, the business side measurements that have trumped everything else. So I think after that, I've pushed these frameworks, these methods further down, and had them as just like this toolbox. So it's sort of like at the start, you sort of like get I was a little bit mesmerized. Wow, this ITIL is going to save the world, but it doesn't.
Yeah, I think my toughest, a great example, by the way, my toughest was probably not in a service management role. I joined a law enforcement organization to help recover a program that was a shade of red you can't see anymore. That's the best way to describe it. And the service desk in that organization had just merged, so it had been 2 into 1. They'd also had a reorganization, and so it got fewer staff, and just couldn't cope with the extra calls coming in from rolling out this new operating system that frankly hadn't been tested and sorted enough. And that was the program I was here to manage. And so within a week I was hearing, we've got to stop the rollout, service desk can't cope. So I think, all right, that's not great then. If we have to stop, then that's going to just mean more cost and more problems and so on. So I went and spoke to the service desk and kind of got a feel for where they were, and they were under-resourced. They weren't getting the information as to which departments were being rolled out. They hadn't actually seen the build. So a series of challenges there. And so we agreed a series of steps, one of which was to actually fund some additional resource from the program into their service desk so they could cope with the calls. Another was to make sure that they were trained on how the operating system worked and what the standard types of questions that might come in were. So they had some good knowledge on that, to give them a few devices so they could actually see them between shifts, and to hold a weekly session with the service desk manager and the team leads, just to say, what issues have you seen? What have we got? What are we doing about those, and where are we rolling out next? And within a couple of months, we kind of got to a point where things were on a slightly better footing. And then towards the end of it, we started to get feedback from the service desk that said, you know what, if all programs worked this way, then that would be great. And that's the point at which I realized that I turned into something that could have been a complete showstopper for the program into something that was being seen as good practice and could be used elsewhere. But yeah, it took a lot of time and a lot of work to get there. Excellent. Brendan, we'll carry on with you for the next question, which is about employee experience. So we talk about customers and sometimes kind of mean the business, or we mean the business and we mean external customers. But what about those internal teams like IT and HR and finance, who equally are employees who use various services, and how do we go about supporting them and managing their satisfaction?
One way that I'm working with an organization right now is they don't visit, let's just call them customers, just so that they'll not give away who they are, but they're not visiting anybody in the customer side. And the reason they're not visiting anybody in the customer side is because nobody in the customer side likes them. And the reason that they don't like them is because they don't visit them. So I've been out on both sides, and I think the company I works with is in the business of saving lives. So that's sort of what they do, that if IT goes down, then IT goes down in different hospitals in and around Oslo. And they don't see this. And I've been working in different places here. Let's take another one like Coca-Cola. And if you walk into Coca-Cola, you can see like every single corridor is like how many Coca-Cola bottles it takes from that they've sold ever say in this factory, and how many Coca-Cola bottles up to the moon. And I walk back to the other place that's saving lives, and there's nothing on the walls, and there's nothing about the value that they're actually delivering. And I was holding this workshop for these guys last week. There was 18 of them. And I was saying, like, you guys don't need anybody in giving you a vision or a mission or anything. You guys are in the business of saving lives. It's like, what's going on? And I started telling them, and 2 people of those 18, like tears just started coming out of their mouths. And they were like, I think we just got a shock that we were sort of reminded what we're actually doing. And I think that's the best thing that we can do to anybody in IT, is take them out of IT and say, this is the job you do is not IT. The job you do is, and take them out to a customer and say, this is the job we do, and this is what happens if we don't do our job. And I think that's it should be the biggest motivator for IT, I think.
Yeah, agreed. I think absolutely spending time with those people that are consuming those services and seeing how it works for them is essential. I told an example which on one of the service improvement sessions around, getting to understand the rhythm of the business and how they consumed the service before trying to set an SLA, an improvement plan in place. And until I'd got how the was a monthly cycle in that case worked, then there was no point thinking about how to improve it. Excellent. Surinder, what's your experience around employee experience and how to best manage that from a service management and satisfaction terms?
Yeah, I completely agree with what Brendan has said. I think the whole siloed approach within businesses is not the way forward. More so now that we work remotely. I think it's always been a big thing. I mean, I haven't actually worked during the pandemic, but I can go back to when I used to go to the office every day and would still act as though we were working remotely and not have that engagement. I'm a firm believer, again, I'm going to go back to this whole idea of talk to people, because if we don't have that conversation and we don't drive a conversation, it's not going to progress. And I don't think you get the best out of anything without talking. So I'm also of the idea that, we should have these roundtable meetings in person and talk about stuff. What I found was engineering, when I was working on my last project, and didn't really engage with the business as much as I would have liked them to, because I was the go-between the two. So IT not talking to the business and actually facing the challenge or assuming that the business are not going to understand them, therefore not even going out there and putting their ideas to them. That was a showstopper for me, because there were behaviors that had been learned for years as to, we're in this gang and they're in that gang, and let's not talk to each other, but let's just work together just to make this work. And it sounds like a bad marriage, but it got to the point where the guys are laughing, but got to the point where I was like, we need to talk, let's mediate. So I've done that before, where I've brought the 2 parties together and said, you know what, we need to talk about this, and we need to discuss things to move forward on how we can make things better if we're not there yet. And that was a big thing for me, because it made my life a lot easier as a designer. So even going back to the points that have been made in the chat, customer journey mapping, creating a roadmap, wireframing, blueprints is part of my daily job. I need engagement from everyone. Therefore, I will go and talk to everyone and you know, pick everyone's brain. But not everyone likes their brain being picked. But that's when you get that kind of, let's talk about this. And then I would make sure, and that's me being assertive and doing it. And I've said this many times on panel sessions and sessions that I've delivered before. Being assertive and saying it in a diplomatic way and getting them on board is something that I really, really advocate. And if I do that, then I can make life easier for not only myself, but the wider business. And that engagement then becomes a bigger thing, right? One quick example I'm going to use is, and I'm just mindful of time, is the fact that I always felt that people sat in service management, for example, you know, just because an incident manager has a lot to say about, you know, or has a lot of input to the design that I'm doing as part of the project, but is not engaged because my project manager doesn't want this incident manager to be engaged. And I'm like, well, 100% I'm bringing this guy in because I think he needs to be here. I need to hear it from ground zero in terms of how I'm going to do this, and you know, getting him engaged and understanding what the actual pinch points or pain points were made my life easier in terms of how I delivered. So bring these people in, even if you have nothing to do with them or don't even know their names, you know, find out who people are and talk to them. Communication is so important, especially nowadays when we actually run away from people most of the time. And let's not normalize that behavior. So keep talking and engaging with the wider business and understanding what everyone actually does and how you can get those cogs to fit in the bigger wheel.
The financial services organisation I worked with was kind of full of people that were using online services and new fancy applications that were on phones and so on. And I was looking after internal services, so finance, risk and HR. And we were talking about the importance of services, and somebody said to me, the HR systems aren't important. And I remember, and it still makes me smile today, saying, I think you'll find once a month you're very, very keen that the HR service that manages payroll puts some money in your bank account. So I think at least one day a month you're going to recognise that I might have one of the most important services in the organisation. They didn't really have an answer to that, but it does remind me of how, you know, services that are used internally and keep staff and employees and contractors working, you know, are nonetheless equally important. I could tell other stories around email not being seen as important in that organisation, and then 2 weeks later it stopped working, and the organisation immediately reported it was losing millions, and guess what? It was on the critical service list within a week. So yeah, I've seen cases where those internal services that are consumed aren't seen as important, and then people realise that actually they're a vital way of doing business. John, what about employee experience and customer satisfaction from your experience?
I'm going to keep it short and sweet. Do we provide better things when we're in a better mood? I think so, right? So if your employee experience is up, right, then you are going to go into work with a bit of relevance. You're going to feel valuable, and that's going to come through in your voice, in your actions, and everything else. So employee experience is absolutely on par with customer experience. Absolutely. And we miss it every single time.
Yeah, agreed. So they're great. That's kind of got to a bit of a break point before I move on to some other questions around service desk. Are there any questions? And I know I've had a few that have come up in the chat. Are there any other questions that people have wanted to ask on what we've covered so far, or any points of clarification? Feel free to ask in the chat, or take yourself off mute if you want to. I'll take silence as you're doing a great job, Mark, and the mentors carry on. So yeah, we'll carry on. I'm interested to know from the panel how highly IT should value their service desk. And yes, it's a slightly loaded question, but I'm interested in kind of how should IT value their service desk. Brendan, do you want to make a start on this one for us, please?
Yeah, I think we should never let go of the idea that it's those people over there working the service desk, but that everybody should be on the service desk as often as that is required. When we say service desk, we're talking like proper frontline. So there's still a lot of organizations in Norway where even the IT boss or IT director takes 2 or 3 days a year and just sits on first line with the people there and figure out what's going on. There's a lot of young people on the front line who are just out of school. They've really low communication skills. They're not great at talking with customers, and so just experience what it's like and know that we're all one team. It's like this idea of IT being split up into different teams. We're only one team, and we're all in the same business of hopefully that our customers are going to leave their work at the end of every day and say, it was no big IT issues today. So that's sort of like the idea that we're trying to get. So I think that's what it should be. And this idea, what is the great service desk, and that again is that's made up by this customer experience, and are the customers happy with their service desk? I think that's basically what I can add there.
I worked at an organisation where the service desk wasn't rated as highly as it should have been, which is probably one of the reasons why I loaded the questions, because I was keen to know what people thought. And at the time, I think one of the smarter heads realised this was the case, and he made a point of taking a day out and, like you're suggesting, just sitting and listening in to service desk calls, and the impact that had, that somebody at that level was actually taking time and listening in to service desk calls. It very quickly resonated up and down the floor and across the IT organization to say, hold on a minute, this is not something we've normally done before, and this means something. So, and a fair number of, we should make sure the service desk has got this information, or we can do this and we could do this. It gave him a real feel for just how hard it was to answer some of those calls. And you found after that some of his direct reports and some of the other senior leadership team chose to do the same. But absolutely, getting some time spending exactly, mirroring the service desk, seeing what they do and how they answer the calls and what tools they've got can be eye-opening. I remember doing it in the next organisation I worked with, because I'd learned from that. And the number of windows that a service desk agent had to have open just to keep track of everything they were doing and try to resolve an issue was really quite mind-blowing. And we're talking about sometimes slightly less experienced and certainly lower paid and experienced staff than perhaps some of the others in IT, but the work they were doing was actually highly skilled. And it was a moment of truth. Every time a customer phoned up to say, I've got an issue or I've got a request, that's when your SLA becomes real. That's when your service starts to take off. So excellent. John, what do you think around IT departments valuing the service desk?
So I'm going to take you on a little story. So 19-year-old, so only a couple of years ago. Imagine this. So I just finished my year of training for the army, and I'd been sent out to Germany to a working unit, what they call a working unit. So that's kind of units that get deployed places. So when I got there, your first job there is to basically go and meet the commanding officer, and he welcomes you to the unit and says, this is what your jobs are, this is what this is. So I'm absolutely petrified, 19 years old, stood outside this commanding officer's, who's been everywhere, his office, and I look across the corridor, and there was a little plaque on the wall, and it said, you never get a second chance to make a first impression. And I've always remembered that, and I think that's exactly what the service desk is. It absolutely blows me away that we don't invest in the service desk, because you can make or break the whole experience from the moment that the customer engages with IT. And it is insane how we, from both people going into service desk thinking it's the first step and then we're going to move out, so their heart and soul's not in it, and from a business perspective or an IT department's perspective, not investing in it enough with training and soft skill training as well, because a lot of that is soft skills. It blows me away.
Yeah, agreed. I think if I was going to take one thing away from this and was talking about how to improve customer satisfaction, I'd say start with your service desk. And many organizations probably undervalue them, certainly don't spend enough time and focus on them, and could definitely invest more time and support. I'd definitely start with the service desk. Surinder, what are your thoughts around IT departments and their service desks?
Yeah, so the guys I think have put it nicely. I feel like the the whole notion of the service desk being underrated or underrepresented even is a big thing within IT, and we don't. I'll put my hand up to this as well, and we don't utilize what we have to the best of our abilities as well. The big thing for me is, and has always been, and I've raised this with various people that I have been working in terms of collecting figures and working on process improvement. The data we get from a service desk is real time, right? So what better source is there than that, is my immediate thought. And I've seen on the back of that, I've actually witnessed firsthand, and I've questioned it and challenged it. Why are we not looking at the whole problem management area, you know, in terms of how we can reduce cost? And it just blows me, and I can't fathom it sometimes as to why it's happening, but it does happen. So me being me, I've put my foot into a few things in my life. So this is one of them in terms of how, service requests are managed. So that's a big thing for me because I started it up here. So I want to know what's going on down there, right? So I'm then doing my little investigation, and those who know me know that I do a thorough one. So I'm now working out what's gone on, you know, in terms of how have we got to this and what were the steps? All right, so you completely missed the point. Problem management have not been engaged. Incidents left, right, and center. So I think to leverage anything, utilize what you've got. You know, you've got real-time data, pick it up, work it out, right? Leverage that in terms of how your problem management function of your business is actually working or not working. Make sure they're engaged. What I found, the one last thing I want to mention is what I found is that I've worked in quite a large print organization as well, and they had a global IT service desk as opposed to my little local IT service desk that, you know, was coming out of Manchester. So this global IT service desk actually thought big and thought of how, you know, how can we make this better, but thought of it in big things, big terms, big challenges. Like, we're going to fix things, but we're going to think big. And I found the whole behavior and approach to it was very different to how it was within central government area. But being diplomatic, I'm like, these guys only have managed print services to look after. Now you can probably work out who this is. But, you know, within government departments, you've got a whole suite of services. So what, you know, do we start with? So instead of looking at each thing, you know, and dissecting it, I think people just brush over it because it's actually quite a big monster to look at or work on, because it's just huge. So I think, a top-down approach kind of helped me understand it. So that's how I think it should work.
Yeah, agreed. The law enforcement organisation I was working with, Service Desk had to cope with the fact that there were well over 1,000 different applications, and at one point 3 different operating systems out there, and 2 different operating systems for mobile phones as well. So yeah, they had some real challenges in terms of just knowing how much to cover. I also recently worked with a professional services organisation where their problem management and work was very influenced by what the message had come in from Service Desk. So Service Desk were part of the problem forum, and one of the subject topics would be what's come into Service Desk in the last week. That was very useful. But they also found it very hard to get adoption of self-service. So self-service has been something that the IT organisation wanted to manage for all sorts of reasons, frankly, mostly around cost saving. And actually the partners within this professional services organisation liked picking up the phone because they knew they'd get a service desk agent at the end of it, and they knew the service desk agent could do what they needed immediately. And they didn't want to have something where they had to log on and type it and get it done. Now, I think that might change. I think as we start to move towards generations of perhaps younger people who are working with different technologies, are more used to kind of ordering things on Amazon and self-service in those sorts of ways, then maybe that will change. But I'm kind of interested in the emergence of self-service and chatbots and what that might mean for Service Desk. But I think there's still no substitute long term for having a manned service desk that understands the business and can answer and address problems. I think chatbots are an interesting development, but not necessarily going to replace a service desk anytime soon.
Mark, could I just add something there?
Of course.
There's 2 teams I'm working with at the moment, and because everybody is on Teams, Microsoft Teams or Zoom or whatever, and this is like become the new norm, we've implemented in two different places a change advisory radar, which is Monday, Wednesday, and Friday. We have 15 minutes for to get rid of the excuse that the service desk we're using, we don't know about what changes are happening. So it's basically 15 minutes where we have 3 people from 3 different service desk locations. We have applications management, normal change management people there, application developers, everybody that knows something big that's going to happen. They're invited in and to tell what's on the radar today. And this is going to be recorded. It's only allowed to be 15 minutes, and it's going to be recorded, and it's going to be posted up with show notes as well. So, example, at 10:30 of these 15 minutes, then we're talking about this big change that's going to affect us on Monday morning. So it's sort of like getting rid of the small complaints that lots of service desks are saying to customers, we never heard about this. Like this, I'm really sorry we didn't hear about this. We have to get rid of that. So we're doing the Teams meeting, recording it, and making it available for the whole organization straight away.
Yeah, perfect, good. I've done similar where you get service desk closer to that portfolio of change that's coming through, and equally the kind of monthly releases and patching cycles that are going on as well.
Yeah.
Good. So I've kind of talked around chatbots a little bit, but we weren't planning to dive on that. I know we've had some really good conversations that have taken a good amount of time. So I'll start. I may skip the odd question just for the mentors in the panel. What are your thoughts on experience of service level agreements and how we manage customer satisfaction through those? And Surinder, we'll start with you, please, for this one.
Yeah, I've kind of touched on this earlier. So
You had a bit.
Yeah, so I'm not going to repeat because I'm just mindful of time. But yeah, I think SLAs are really important in terms of how various things work within a business. But I also feel like sometimes they are disregarded and not kind of put up there as they should be. And I use that again, quite loosely, because I think sometimes it's an afterthought and it's not something that's looked at by the project, especially because they just think, oh, okay, whatever happens down there happens down there. And if we look at SIAM environments, this is where I've seen it happen. It's been a big thing, so we'll deal with it when we get to it, is kind of what happens. And they have been dropped, but on my last project, I was quite mindful of the fact that they were not looked at to the nth degree that they should have been. Therefore, again, there were those penalties that I didn't want to see, and taking an account, from amber into red and bringing it back into green is hard work. And I know that sessions have been done on that as well, right? So just don't get yourself into that if you can avoid it, and talk about how you're going to set these SLAs and engage with the business and engage with IT, and don't discount anyone, because that's where the problem is half the time.
Yeah, it's interesting. Again, I've written an article on service level agreements and also targets and how they drive behaviour. I've probably now worked in more organisations that don't have formal service level agreements, as in a written document with targets that's signed off between IT and the business for services, than I have those that have got them. Certainly the first couple of organisations I worked with were very keen on them. They had a template, you filled them in, you got them completed, and we kind of learned to evolve and improve them from there. But I think I've probably now worked in more organisations that actually don't have SLAs. They have targets around resolving incidents and the time to restore service if there's a disaster, and how many failed changes you can have, and so on. So there are targets. But to say that there is a service level agreement between IT and the business for one or more services, no, not so much. So it's interesting that we talk about service level agreements and customer satisfaction, but actually my experience is there are as many organisations without them that I found as there are with them. Brendan, what are your thoughts on service level agreements and satisfaction?
I agree on that. There's very few that have them formal agreements, but I think also that we had this goal of a one-page SLA, and that's possibly something like yours, thinking about that. Let's just get rid of all the blah blah that a customer shouldn't have to go on an IT course to understand an agreement. Like there's something really seriously wrong if that's the situation. So what we've done is we've sit with customers and given them a marker pen and said, stroke out anything that you don't think belongs on this agreement between us. And then it's very useful to remove everything that's legal. There shouldn't be anything legal in that. I get everything legal into a separate contract and just fix that. And this should be the simple uptime, response time, how often they're going to meet. It should be very simple on all of these agreements.
I remember having a very passionate discussion with somebody because I believed that you could genuinely write a service level agreement on the page, and they didn't believe you could. And so I proved that you could. To have a point, the key things that we were agreeing, and the secret for me was kind of removing all of that boilerplate and legal stuff and saying, you know what, we'll have a service charter or contract or whatever you want to call it that covers the stuff that's consistent across all services. But the things you need to know that are specific to that service, I believe you can get them on a page if that's something the customer wants. And I was working.
I think we can build up a lot more respect with the customer if we do that. Because
Absolutely.
then it's like we're not here to bluff you. Anybody can put a report together that's green and say we're doing a great job, and on our side it looks great. So it's sort of like taking the customer with a little bit more respect and setting more value in their time.
Agreed. Although I did work with a customer who was very detailed orientated, and he really loved going through the detail of an SLA. I got to about draft 20 before we signed it off, but I would say that's still the best SLA I've ever written, because it didn't just measure incidents and problems and changes. It also recognized the key customer outcomes that were needed and had those as one of the measures that we had. So it wasn't just have we hit the IT targets, it's have we hit the customer targets, and those were baked into the service level agreement between IT and the business, because ultimately they couldn't hit their targets without the IT service.
Because that's this real dilemma in service management, which service is actually helping the customer achieve the outcomes. And it should really be called system level agreements, because the only thing we're doing is presenting numbers on our IT systems. We're not presenting numbers of the uptime of the amount of people that could print in the company. And anytime the print service is down, it's down for 3,000 people at the same time. And that's a cost per 3,000 people. And there's no way we're going to give an SLA report of 15% uptime of the printing service during the last month. So the actual term of service level agreements with especially IT's definition of the word service is more of a joke. So I think you have to get real with that with the customer as soon as possible.
Yeah, agreed. I dialed into a UK RTSMF session that was talking around experience level agreements, which ITIL 4 is very keen on. And a couple of the panelists who weren't part of UK RTSMF but were suppliers were very keen to kind of promote that these were brand new things that had never been done before. And I was bashing away at the keyboard going, I was doing this 20 years ago. But they were very keen to say it's ITIL 4 and therefore it's brand new. And I kind of went, no, not every IT organisation was quite as backward thinking as perhaps you might think. So yeah, it was an interesting debate. Unfortunately, I couldn't stay for the rest of the session, so I couldn't continue with that point. One of the things that Kaz has reminded me of, and again, I refer everybody to the service level agreement article that I wrote and published following a question of the week chat. The part that was published on LinkedIn. I think there's a series of things I've learned the hard way through service level agreements, and one of them is that when you write a service level agreement, it's not for life. It's a living document and it needs to be changed. And I used to say a service level agreement is like a pot of yogurt. It will expire at some point and you want to get there before it starts to smell a bit. And so I'd have, when a service level agreement was agreed, I would have a date where it had to be reviewed. And I said, it's not valid if not reviewed beyond that point. I knew Brendan would like that analogy. Obviously, if a project or something comes along in the meantime, you can change it before that expiry date. But I would always have we will refresh it at this point. And sometimes the refresh were I'll just move the dates on. And sometimes it was actually, this is a bigger deal than we thought. But I would always make sure that a service level agreement, once it's been signed off, has a date by which it is then refreshed and updated. John, I'm going to skip to some of the other questions, but I was just keen to make sure you had a chance to talk around service level agreements and satisfaction before we moved on.
Okay, mate, I'll be really quick then. So I think the reason why service level agreements have got such a bad rap is because we tend to use traditional ones and we tend to put them in front of a customer and they mean absolutely nothing to them. Okay, Okay, so if we say, you know, 99.8% uptime in the year, you go, well, that's amazing. But if that was down on the one time that they needed it, or you actually put that into hours, I think it works out over a 24/7 service or something, that critical service that the business would die if it wasn't there could be down for 4 days straight, and you would still have a green SLA. Right.
Yes.
So that is just ridiculous. Right. So I'm a very, very strong believer of there are such things as IT SLAs. I love what Brendan said about system. And I think we should keep them internal to us. And I think we should measure the experience. You go to an Uber or a Airbnb and the world we live in now, right? We go off reviews. Uber doesn't say, Uber doesn't send me a report saying 99.9% of our cars turned up on time. You know, they don't say, you know, we had this many, so they don't, right? We go onto a review thing and we say, Uber, this driver got a rating of 3.9. I'm not going to use them. It's as simple as that, right? And I'm sure Uber have got all their internal measurements to figure out what services they have. And I'm sure they've sat with their customers and gone, what do you need? And worked it out, but they don't display them. So that's my view on SLAs.
Yeah, agreed. Excellent. Good. We were going to cover a few more topics, but I'll move this on a little bit. I'm kind of keen, given it's a hot topic at the moment, to talk around what COVID, the pandemic and lockdown has taught us around customer satisfaction and service management in general. Brendan, are you happy to go first on this one again, please?
No problem. I think it gives us a huge opportunity to impress customers. So there's a friend of mine, Marianne, I just called her today. I've been working with her lately and said, yeah, how's it going? So you're at home and I'm at home. We don't see each other that much. And what's going on? And I did this with another friend last week and they said, so are you trying to sell or what's going on? No, seriously. I'm just hope you're okay. I think we have this huge opportunity we've never had an opportunity like this to really impress our customers that we care about them. I think this huge opportunity across the whole world where we can see the actual people, and it's a nice opportunity to show that we care. Yeah,
no, absolutely agreed. Surinder, what's your experience of either providing service or consuming service, and what COVID has taught us around that?
Well, firstly, I think we've got a lot more time to work on it, considering we don't travel like crazy people in London. But jokes aside, I think personally, my experience has always been a very rushed experience, and it's always been not well thought out. I mean, this is with the business. I think now that we're working remotely as well, like during COVID, it's become a thing. I did work with a British council a few months back on stuff I was doing with mentoring professionals, and I could hear the sense of kind of a cry for help, saying, you know, we need to make this work better because currently it's just falling over and it continues to. And we don't get the processes and the procedures right here, it's going to continue being this way. So I think it's very important now more than ever that we listen to each other, especially behind screens. And I'm taking that behavioral approach to this, because I feel sometimes in rooms, you know, we do go on a bit, but now I think, you know, and we have the opportunity to kind of dissect our thoughts and whatever we plan to do. But now, because we don't see people as much, especially during lockdown and COVID, I think it's more important that we reach out and actually draw those out as well, because my area of work, visuals really help. So I think that's something that has become a big thing in terms of how I deliver design as well. There's a lot more drawing, there's a lot more use of these apps, you know, that probably weren't touched before. So utilize what you have, technology, and leverage that.
Agreed. I think it's fundamentally changed the way in which many organisations consume their services. I was working with a professional services organisation when lockdown came in. They were very much about presenteeism. They were about being in the office or being with their client. It was expected to be there 5 days a week at least. They worked long hours in the office, so the office was very important to them. Then lockdown hit. And lockdown suddenly meant that within a couple of days, they needed desktops because they needed to move away from their desktops to laptops, and they needed to think about working from home. And many of them hadn't actually seriously thought about working from home, because when they worked, they went to the office and they were in the office for as long as it needed. So that pivoted the whole service model on its head, and it went away from WAN and LAN and internal services being very important, and towards remote connectivity and some of the remote working services being more important. And actually, it significantly expanded their catalogue of critical services. They'd always had those as services on the list, but not one of their most critical services. And kind of overnight, they had to look at what those services were to enable people to be able to connect. And how to uplift them, because they hadn't been designed with the level of resilience and capacity that was needed to get an entire firm working from home. So I think it has definitely changed some things, and I think it's proven that we can do a lot very quickly. You know, the ability to get laptops out and to get work done. Some organisations were doing things that they previously thought were impossible, and were kind of doing the Alice in Wonderland comment of, do 6 miracles before breakfast. But there was then a whole bunch of things to then be sorted out afterwards. And I think some organizations are still going through a list of, right, where are all those applications and where are those laptops and what happens afterwards and so on. So there's definitely some things to be managed. John, what's your experience of COVID and what it's taught us around service and customer satisfaction?
2 things. So from a service management perspective, how bad were our BCP and DR plans?
Very good point. Yeah.
So I'm pretty sure everybody went through that and went, holy crap, we didn't think we were going to use these, and we had to, and how badly they were implemented and or not even used at all. So that was really relevant for me and brought it out and put a much needed spotlight on them. And secondly, it was amazing from my perspective, because for about 2 years now, I've been trying to push for the service desk to work from home as part of their shifts, because I just thought, they just get hammered. And I said, out of all the IT departments, we monitor these guys so much that if anyone was okay to work from home, it would be a service desk.
Yeah.
And I got pushed back as in, oh, you'll hear dogs in the background, they'll answer their calls in their pajamas, and I was like, who cares, seriously? If they're happier. Yeah, exactly, right? So I was really, really pushing for this, and I actually went down the forgiveness rather than permission path, and started putting people from home, and our service levels and our satisfaction started to increase. Then COVID came along, and then they just went, right, everyone's now got to work from home. Yeah. And lo and behold, the best kind of part of IT that worked so well, and we could tell whether it was working really, really well because we monitor it so much, was the service desk. So it was.
Your point on business continuity plans is well made. The professional services organisation I was talking about actually had offices in the Far East, and so after SARS and Ebola and the other pandemics that had struck there, they'd certainly looked at their recovery plans and had got something more appropriate in mind. And so when the pandemic hit, they perhaps are a bit more planned and prepared than many. But yeah, it's certainly, I think organisations that have got continuity and disaster recovery plans are now taking a hard look at those, and I don't think it'll be hard to get interest and support on those for the next few budget cycles. I'm going to open it up for questions. I had lots more prompts to cover, but I'm delighted that the questions have come up really well and have generated a lot of discussion. So, are there any questions from those that have dialed in that they want to ask the panel while you've got the captive audience? If not, I'll kind of wrap this up with a final question and move on. But if there are any questions you've got for this panel of mentors, then do feel free to ask now. Silence is golden, right? So I'll thank John, Brendan, and Surinder for the time, whether it be evening or whether it be morning, for dialing into the session and giving you time. And if as a part of the closure, you can just give us kind of the one thing to take away around service management and customer satisfaction. What's the one advice you'd give? Surinder, we'll go first with you, please.
I think everyone's going to predict what I'm going to say now, but I'd say engage, talk, and communicate. And when you're talking, make sure you're listening as well, because listening is also a great skill, as Brendan would agree with me.
Excellent. Great. Thanks, Surinder. Brendan.
I think that the exact question you should ask to as many people as possible outside of IT. You should say, what's the single one piece of advice that you could give me to raise customer satisfaction or to do a better job?
And I have asked just that, but both for internal IT departments and customers, and had some great comments that have come back. Sometimes consistent themes, and sometimes a nugget from one person that you can take and make a real difference. So, and John, what's the one thing that you'd recommend people take away around service management and customer satisfaction?
You have got to collect feedback. You have got to open that two-way feedback, and you have got to collect feedback. We live in the world of instant feedback, and we have got to create channels and then take that feedback seriously.
Yeah.
Okay, actually do something with it. When customers go, this is not working, then we need to sit down, address it, prioritize it, and work on it, and get back to them and bring them into that loop.
Yeah. I inherited a service once that had service reviews, and a customer had raised the same point 3 times. And by the time I inherited the service and they raised it again, it was kind of like, yep, somebody needs to fix it. And they went, at last, somebody's listened, rather than we just make the same point every month. You know, if somebody gives you feedback, you need to do something about it. For me, I think the one takeaway would be value your service desk. Go and spend time with them, understand what they're hearing, understand how difficult their role is, and recognize that from an IT viewpoint, every time somebody contacts your service desk, it's a moment of truth. It's when the service hits the road. It's when the people that consume and use your service actually start to see the benefit of it, and absolutely value your service desk. And I think many organizations, particularly the IT departments, don't as much as they should. So thank you very much, everybody. It's been a great session. We had done some prep for this, but I hadn't actually had a chance to get together with the mentors, so this has worked really well. Thanks, Brendan. Thanks, Surinder. Thanks, John, and thanks, Dev, in the background for setting this up and facilitating it. I know you've had one or two different rooms and technologies to work with, but it's worked very well. If anybody has any questions, then do catch up with us on the Slack channel. We'll publish this recording. And that will be available on the YouTube channel. But yeah, we'll have Slack, and I'll be back to answering questions of asking and answering questions of the week once I've had a day to recover from 3 sessions in a week. So good evening, good night, and good morning, depending where in the world you are. Thanks very much, everybody. And yeah, look forward to catching up with you all soon. Thanks, everybody.
Nice session, Mark. Nice going.
Yeah, great session, Mark. Thank you,
John.
Surinder, Brendan. Thanks,
Thanks.
everybody.
Excellent. Thanks, everybody.
Thanks.